It didn't look right. Twin cannons in the wings, a big radial engine up front, and a wide stance that made it sit low and mean. This wasn't how fighters were supposed to look or fight, but the Focke-Wulf FW 190 didn't care about expectations. While other planes turned gracefully through the sky, the 190 punched holes through it. Fast, durable, and brutal, it stunned the Allies and changed the rules of air combat forever. Pilots feared it, commanders respected it, and enemies scrambled to counter it. So how did this strange machine earn the nickname Butcher Bird? Let's find out. Setting the stage, air combat before the Maverick. Before the FW 190 tore onto the scene, fighter doctrine in Europe was rigid. Aircraft were designed with tight frames, liquid-cooled engines, and sleek lines. The idea was to build fast, nimble dogfighters that could climb, turn, and shoot, all while being relatively easy to manufacture and maintain. The Luftwaffe's own Messerschmitt Bf 109 embodied this perfectly. Introduced in the mid-1930s, the Bf 109 was revolutionary for its time. It had a streamlined fuselage, retractable landing gear, and a liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz engine that gave it excellent speed and climb performance. At the outbreak of World War II, it proved dominant over Polish, French, and even early British fighters. Light, fast, and maneuverable, it was everything a fighter was supposed to be. But there was a problem: fragility. The 109's compact design left little room for armor or cockpit space. Visibility was poor. Its narrow-track landing gear made it dangerously unstable on takeoff and landing, costing the Luftwaffe thousands of aircraft, often without enemy fire. And worst of all, its engine relied on a vulnerable liquid cooling system. One hit to a coolant line and the plane was done in seconds. As the war evolved and new threats emerged, especially from increasingly advanced British aircraft like the Spitfire Mark V, some in the Luftwaffe realized the Bf 109 had limitations that couldn't be ignored. Germany needed something tougher, faster, and more versatile. Not a replacement, but a complement. A second frontline fighter that could fill the growing gaps in the Luftwaffe's capabilities. In 1937, the German Air Ministry issued a specification for such an aircraft. Most companies responded with conservative upgrades of the 109's design, but one man, Kurt Tank, the chief designer at Focke-Wulf, thought differently. A World War I veteran, Tank believed combat wasn't about flying pretty lines in the sky. It was about surviving mud, chaos, damage, and exhaustion. He set out to design a fighter that could thrive in real war, not just win air shows. And when his vision finally took flight, it shocked the world. Because the FW 190 didn't just tweak the rules of air combat, it flipped the table over. Enter the Rebel, origins of the design. When Kurt Tank started designing the FW 190 in the late 1930s, he wasn't interested in chasing elegance. He wanted a fighter that could endure the dirty, chaotic grind of war. Drawing on his first-hand knowledge from World War I trenches and his experience as a pilot and engineer, Tank focused on survivability, simplicity, and raw combat power. The biggest break from tradition? The engine. Tank chose a BMW 801 radial engine, a 14-cylinder air-cooled monster that delivered more than 1,600 horsepower. This decision alone sparked outrage among Luftwaffe traditionalists. Radial engines, they claimed, were too bulky for frontline fighters. They created drag, hurt aerodynamics, and didn't look the part. But Tank wasn't swayed. Radial engines, unlike inline ones, didn't rely on a delicate cooling system. They could take bullets to the front and keep running. In combat, that mattered more than a few extra kilometers per hour. And the BMW 801 came with another advantage: it was tough. In testing, the engine withstood punishing heat and stress without failure, making it perfect for the unpredictable battlefield. Tank paired this engine with an airframe that was rugged and modular. Everything about the FW-190 was designed for quick repairs and battlefield resilience. The landing gear was mounted in the wings, not the fuselage, giving it a wide, stable stance on the ground. No more flipping over on landing. No more pilots dying before even engaging the enemy. Inside the cockpit, visibility was superb. Unlike the cramped BF-109, the FW-190 gave pilots space to breathe and a raised seat for better sightlines. The controls were laid out intuitively, reducing training time and improving response in combat. When the first prototype flew in 1939, test pilots were stunned. The FW-190 was heavier than the BF-109 but more stable. It had a wicked roll rate and impressive acceleration, especially at low altitudes. This wasn't just a sidekick for the 109, it had the potential to surpass it. By 1941, the Butcherbird was ready for war. And when it finally entered service over France, Allied pilots didn't know what hit them. Breaking the mold. Unusual features that worked. The FW-190 didn't just challenge conventions, it obliterated them. From the engine out front to the armor around the cockpit, nearly every design feature broke with tradition and somehow made it deadlier. Start with the engine. The BMW 801 radial wasn't just powerful, it was smart. It featured an automatic engine management system that handled fuel mixture, propeller pitch, and supercharger settings. This gave pilots a major edge in combat. They could focus on flying and fighting, not fiddling with dials mid-dogfight. Then came the undercarriage. Unlike the BF-109's narrow and awkward gear that retracted outward, the FW-190's wheels retracted inward from the wings. This created a wide-track landing gear that made takeoff and landing dramatically safer, especially on muddy, improvised airstrips common on the Eastern Front. Next was the cockpit. German pilots called it luxurious. Visibility was excellent, especially with the bubble canopy on later models. The cockpit was spacious and clearly laid out, helping new pilots adapt quickly. This mattered more as the Luftwaffe lost its veteran aces and needed replacements who could get up to speed fast. But the FW-190's greatest feature? Durability. This plane could take damage that would shred other fighters. It had armor plating around the engine and cockpit. It used tough, interchangeable components that could be swapped quickly between aircraft. Mechanics loved it. Pilots trusted it. Enemies feared it. And then came the weapons. The FW-190 started with 2 machine guns above the engine and 4 20mm cannons in the wings. Later versions carried even more firepower, 30mm cannons, air-to-air rockets, and even bombs. It was a one-plane arsenal, just as comfortable strafing a convoy as it was tearing through Spitfires. Its performance at low and medium altitudes, where most dogfights happened, was unmatched. The FW-190 could dive like a hawk, roll faster than anything in the sky, and hit like a freight train. British pilots who had grown accustomed to the BF-109 suddenly found themselves outgunned and outflown. This wasn't a refined duelist. It was a street brawler in the sky. And in the savage, swirling chaos of World War II dogfights, the FW-190 was exactly what Germany needed. An aircraft built not for honor, but for survival and slaughter. First blood, debut, and battlefield shock. The FW-190 entered combat over Western Europe in August 1941, and the results were immediate and terrifying. British RAF squadrons flying the latest Spitfire Mark V expected the usual aerial skirmishes with BF-109s. Instead, they met something far more dangerous. At low and medium altitudes, the FW-190 tore through Spitfires like a buzzsaw. It outrolled them, out-accelerated them, and packed heavier armament. RAF pilots were stunned by its dive speed and maneuverability. It wasn't supposed to be this fast or this deadly. The first major wake-up call came during a sweep over France in September 1941. A small formation of FW-190s engaged a group of Spitfires and tore them apart. The RAF lost 6 planes. The Germans lost none. British command dismissed it as a fluke, but over the next few months the story repeated itself again and again. So devastating was the FW-190's early success that the RAF launched Operation Air Thief, a plan to capture one of the new fighters intact. But fate intervened. In June 1942, a disoriented German pilot flying an FW-190A3 accidentally landed at an RAF base in Wales. The British now had a complete, flyable specimen. When RAF engineers tested it, they were stunned. At combat altitudes, the FW-190 was superior to the Spitfire Mark V in almost every way. It could dive faster, roll quicker, and deliver more firepower. British pilots were ordered to avoid direct combat unless absolutely necessary. It took months before the RAF introduced the Spitfire Mark IX to level the playing field. Until then, the Luftwaffe's FW-190 pilots had total dominance in many parts of the Western Front. The Butcher Bird wasn't just a new fighter, it was a psychological weapon. Allied pilots began to dread the sight of it. Dogfights that once felt winnable became high-stakes duels with a predator that seemed built to kill. In its first year of combat, the FW-190 flipped the balance of power and proved that Germany could still shock the skies. Dominance in action, campaigns, and combat roles. By late 1942, the FW-190 wasn't just outperforming Allied fighters, it was reshaping Germany's entire air strategy. Its success over Western Europe encouraged the Luftwaffe to deploy it more widely, expanding its role far beyond traditional fighter duty. The Butcher Bird was no longer just a duelist, it became an all-purpose weapon. First came the fighter-bomber role. The FW-190's sturdy frame and powerful engine made it ideal for carrying bombs. Unlike the fragile Bf-109, the FW-190 could dive with heavy ordnance, deliver precision strikes, and escape with speed. It was soon pounding Allied shipping in the English Channel, hitting radar stations, and smashing armored columns on the Eastern Front. Next came ground attack variants, like the FW-190F and G models. These were flying tanks. Outfitted with additional armor plating and able to carry massive payloads, they were used extensively on the Eastern Front against Soviet tanks, supply lines, and troop concentrations. Armed with rockets, cluster bombs, and 30mm cannons, these aircraft could decimate entire formations with a single pass. In Italy and North Africa, the FW-190 also proved its worth in hit-and-run air raids, targeting vulnerable Allied airfields and fuel depots. Fast, rugged, and difficult to intercept, it could get in and out before enemy fighters scrambled. Its performance was so impressive that it began replacing the vaunted Stuka dive bomber, a symbol of early blitzkrieg tactics. The FW-190 could dive just as steeply, carry more firepower, and, critically, survive. It was faster, more maneuverable, and didn't require suicidal precision flying. Even in the skies over Germany itself, the FW-190 found a home. As American bombers flooded the skies, the Luftwaffe began modifying the Butcher Bird into a bomber interceptor. Some variants carried air-to-air rockets, while others were fitted with upward-firing cannons to blast B-17s from below. No matter the mission, escort, interception, bombing, or strafing, the FW-190 delivered. It was the ultimate multi-tool in Germany's aerial arsenal, and while its rivals often excelled in one role, the FW-190 could do almost everything, and do it with ferocity. It wasn't just a fighter anymore, it was a platform, a predator. a machine that changed depending on the mission but never lost its bite. The tides turn, Allied responses and challenges. As dominant as the FW-190 was, war is never static, and by 1944, the tide was turning hard against Germany. The Allies were learning, adapting, upgrading, and for the Butcherbird, the skies were becoming less forgiving. The Spitfire Mark IX was the first major wake-up call. Introduced in late 1942, it finally gave RAF pilots the performance to challenge the FW-190 on near equal terms. Better high-altitude capabilities, improved armament, and smarter tactics began to claw back air superiority. Then came the Americans. With waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators flooding the skies, the Luftwaffe scrambled FW-190s to intercept them. While early on the 1900 was effective, especially with underwing rocket tubes and heavier cannons, it couldn't stop the relentless tide. The Allied bombers kept coming, but the real game-changer was the P-51 Mustang. Fast, long-ranged and deadly, it could escort bombers deep into Germany and still have fuel left for dogfights. Worse for the Luftwaffe, it could climb with the FW-190, dive with it, and outmaneuver it in some scenarios. Suddenly, the Butcherbird wasn't the apex predator anymore, and the Luftwaffe itself was crumbling. Its veteran aces were dying or rotated out. In their place came poorly trained pilots, often with only a few hours of flight time before being thrown into battle. The FW-190, once praised for its ease of handling, now had to compensate for inexperience, and it couldn't always save its pilot. Resources were drying up too. Fuel shortages meant fewer practice flights. Allied bombings crippled factories and supply lines. Even the rugged FW-190 struggled to stay airworthy under these conditions. Then, in 1944, the Allies introduced radar-equipped night fighters, electronic countermeasures, and smarter bombing routes that made interception harder. The FW-190, which had briefly been tested in night fighting roles under wild boar tactics, couldn't keep up in this new technological race. Germany responded with desperate modifications, armor kits, rockets, makeshift weaponry, but these only made the plane heavier and less agile. And when the Me-262 jet entered the war, it made even the FW-190 look outdated. The Butcherbird had flown too far, too fast. It had bent the rules and dominated the skies, but now the world had caught up. The FW-190 wasn't graceful. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't even supposed to work, but it did, brilliantly. With its thick armor, brutal firepower, and snarling engine, it turned the tide when Germany needed it most. It didn't follow the blueprint for a perfect fighter. It burned the blueprint and rewrote it in smoke and steel. The Allies may have won the war, but even their pilots admitted nothing in the sky hit harder than the Butcherbird. And in an era of legends, the FW-190 earned its own myth. It didn't just survive the rules, it shredded them.